Hey, welcome to the Fine Print, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Caleb Teskey, and believe it or not, another great guest for you today. It's going to be a good one here. Let's do our homework off the top, as we usually do. Great show with Lou Rinaldi on Sunday, Connecticut patient advocate. He's been on the show a couple of times before. Always love chopping it up with Lou. If you didn't catch my interview with Anthony Minetti, who's a dispensary owner and a pharmacy owner down in New Jersey, Camden Apothecary and the dispensary at Bell Rexall Pharmacy down in New Jersey. Another great chat about rescheduling cannabis there. Keith Straub from Normal, great interview with Keith. Luke Mason, another lab guy who unfortunately had to shut down his lab out in Colorado due to the market conditions, it kind of sounded like. And, Jamie Toth, if you didn't catch my interview with Jamie, some of her work is probably going to tie into some of what we're going to talk about today. And coming up, I got some really good stuff. On Thursday, I've got an interview with RadSource. They do X-ray remediation for cannabis. I already had Carly Bader on from Willow Industries. I'm going to have RadSource on Thursday, so that should be an interesting discussion. On Sunday, the 9th, I got my buddy Evan Carlson, who's working with NEK Broadband, trying to bring internet access to rural Vermont. And then on the 11th, I got AC Moon, who's an old school legacy hustler, and had a bunch of raids and stuff like that and dealt with a bunch of cops. So I think that's also going to be a great discussion. My guest today, guys, I've been talking to a lot of people in the lab space. If you didn't catch my interview with Chris Hudala from Pro Verde, that'd be another good one to check out. But my guest today, he's the co-founder of MCR Labs. Boom, there it is. Please welcome to the show, Yasha Kahn. Yasha, thanks for being here today, man.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Before we do anything serious, would you give us a 5-minute life story?
Absolutely. I'll give you the cannabis-related one and not other life stuff. So started smoking cannabis in high school. And then after high school, I was an athlete and used cannabis to help me recover, to help me sleep, to increase appetite. And then, it was just a part of my life. And then my brother and Mike Kahn and Scott Churchill said that there's going to be a need for cannabis testing in Massachusetts. And this was, I think, in 2012 or 2013. And then we started up a cannabis testing lab. That was really interesting. That was before it became legal. That was before there were licensed entities. And we were just testing for whoever wanted to know what's in their products. Years went by and we kept building this lab, and it was interesting in every way. And one of the cool things was for nerds like us, who also like cannabis, is having a lab that can answer all sorts of questions and myths that we knew, or questions that we had for years before that. And we used this lab in addition to just testing. We did all sorts of just like fascinating things, testing, what's in the stems, what's in reclaim, what are the different storage conditions, and how's that going to affect cannabis storage over time. All sorts of these kind of things. And then we decided to open a laboratory in Pennsylvania because things were going well. Everything was, we were doing a good job. Our clients were happy. And we opened up that lab in Pennsylvania. And within a couple of years, we saw, once the market was building up, we saw an interesting issue of our customers. They would come to us and say, we're not going to test with you anymore because this other lab is passing all of our samples. And we thought that was ridiculous. We worked with them. We did what we could. But then all of our cultivator customers would leave us because they can get passes elsewhere. And so we went to regulators, and regulators pretty much just told us to leave them alone. And at some point we decided Pennsylvania was not the market for us. It's not a market we could compete in. And then we opened up, so over the last couple of years, we opened up in Maine and New York. And we also started to experience the same thing that we had in Pennsylvania. It started to happen in Massachusetts, where cannabis products started to appear at, 40% THC, things that we imagined or did not imagine could be feasible, that so many products suddenly appeared at such high potencies. So we went to regulators and told them, like, this what's happening. We weren't the only labs. We weren't the only lab that came to regulators, and we would say, look, this is what's happening. Can you guys investigate, because something is happening that shouldn't be happening. There seems to be result manipulation. Can you guys investigate? And that was around 2 years ago. Nothing happened. They didn't do anything. Around that same time, I came across an article written by Lester Black in 538, where he described the work that Keegan Skeet and Jim McRae did in Washington State. And Washington State was fascinating. They had an open data platform. So all cannabis testing data was publicly available. Jim McRae got a hold of this data, analyzed it, and identified fraud in the cannabis testing industry, reported it to regulators, reported it to journalists. And then, after a lot of work by him and persistence, 4 labs got shut down. He did something similar in Nevada. And when data scientists get access to this kind of data, they report on this loudly. They talk about it. And then journalists pick this up and ask regulators the question of what's going on. Why have you not done anything about this? And I thought that was fascinating. Then maybe a year and a half ago, I met Jamie Toth. And and she was, what she did was just incredible. And I've heard about this, but I just never knew it was actually doable. Is she did a Freedom of Information Act request to data in Oregon. She got it and she analyzed it and she showed what's happening. And so after that happened, after I learned what she did, I was like, why can't I do that? And Jeff Rawson also did Freedom of Information Act requests in Massachusetts. And so I followed up what those giants did. And I sent Freedom of Information Act requests to nearly every state in the country, and got what scientists refer to as a shitload of data. And that's where we are now. And I hope that we can discuss that process, what that data is, why it's so valuable, how it can help with this and many other things with you today.
Awesome. Yeah. And I've also had Lester on the show, guys. For those of you guys that don't know, Lester Black is the cannabis editor for sfgate.com, writing some really great stories out on the left coast here. And for the rest of this discussion, Yasha, you're going in the big box. And for sure, what would you like to do first? Because I have a few notes, and here's somewhat Cyclops. There you go. Thanks for watching, Jamie.
Mm-hmm.
FOIA crew. Do you want to talk about the FOIA stuff first? Because that's on my list. And I've definitely been curious. Let's just do that, because I've tried some in Vermont with varying results, and it seems like doing this from state to state can be very tricky. It seems like some states are more open to providing information. In some states, it's really a pain to get at it. So I'd love to hear about your experience there.
So I'd love to talk about it, maybe not that much, a little bit, because I think this discussion would be best if it was both Jamie and me discussing it, because she has been on the other side of data governance. I think that would be a really full discussion. But from my perspective, the world and regulators have been collecting a lot of data for the last couple of decades. And this is, every agency collects so much data. And in cannabis, that cannabis as a crop has more testing data than any other crop does, because every cannabis product has to be tested for cannabinoids, terpenes, mycotoxins, all sorts of microbiological contaminants, heavy metals, pesticides, water activity, moisture, so on. And all of this data is not kept just by the labs, but shared with the states. And these states, they collect this data and they hold on to it. Most of them do nothing with this data. But we as citizens, through our taxes, we pay for the work that they do, for the storage, for all of it. And so the Freedom of Information Act should give access to all of us, give us access to that data. And that data is huge in terms of not just a lot of data, but 10 years ago, when policies were being set across the country, legislators and regulators were setting these policies with kind of like they were blind. First off, it was a Schedule 1 drug, so there's very little research that could happen. But also, we didn't have access to millions of data points, millions of flowers that have been tested. And so now we actually have all this data, all this information, and we can use it to set good policy. And I would like to share my screen to just share a little bit on.
Let me read this comment first. This is from Jamie. Again, such an honor to be mentioned, Yasha. Your work is inspiring and exemplary. I'm truly honored to have been a part of it. Thanks for tuning in, Jamie. And yeah, let's go right into it here, Yasha. I'm really hoping you're gonna walk us through and show my audience some pretty pictures, because I know we like stuff like that. I'm certainly a visual learner myself, so I was fascinated when we first spoke and you showed me some of the stuff.
Okay, so do you see my screen?
I'm going to share. I think I can add that to the stage right now.
Perfect. Okay, so data collection. This has, we've collected data from 11 states, almost 2,000 flower samples, 127 different laboratories, and a lot of data, a lot of tests.
Over like a decade here, huh, Yasha?
Yeah. Yep. Cool. It spans states across the country. Over the next couple of months, I expect to get at least 4 states. So this is really like a good description of a good subset of the entire country. So we understand what is cannabis from the data perspective. This does not answer everything, but ignoring this or not using this data is also a big missed opportunity. And so having this kind of data allows the answering of many questions that no individual lab would be able to answer. A couple examples is seasonality of aspergillus. What is potency? Is it increasing across the country over time? Is there fraud in this industry? What is a strain? Like, how homogeneous is one strain? Are there strains that are more susceptible or less susceptible to mold? And so on. There's so many different questions that specifically from the data we can answer, and a lot of questions that can be answered together with a wet lab, like a chemistry lab, and this big data. And so over the last couple of months, I've partnered with some of the top scientists in cannabis and outside of cannabis, because this is the first time that such a big data set is available. And we are, with these different groups, starting to write for peer-reviewed journals, which I'm extremely excited about.
Cool.
So some examples. During compliance testing, what's the correlation between water activity and mold? And Caleb, I already asked you this before, so it's unfair for me to ask you this again.
I knew nothing about this. Sorry to cut you off, but I knew nothing about this. So I was very fascinated when you posed that to me. Yeah.
And so one of the first things that I do with data is I visualize it. I try to put it in different charts to really understand, like, is there anything interesting to look at, to zoom in on? And something that I was just assuming was going to happen was that we're going to see if there's more water activity or more moisture, there's going to be more mold in compliance tests. But taking a look at the 42,000 data points from Maryland, there is no positive correlation between water activity and mold.
Huh.
We see the same thing in Colorado, fewer data points, but same thing. And same thing in Nevada, 105,000 data points, and there is no correlation between.
So we're looking at moisture on the x-axis and then yeast and mold count on y?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, cool.
And the reason here that we don't see a correlation, the reason why I thought there would be was that's what I always heard. More moisture, that's where mold grows and needs moisture, water activity to grow. But in reality, the difference between a well-dried and not well-dried product is a few days during the curing process, drying and curing process. And so, the flowers that happen to only cure dry for 14 days instead of 16 days, they didn't get a significantly higher, lower amount of mold. That's all it is. So just a interesting finding. Another one is aspergillus.
Yeah, hot topic right now.
Yep. There's seasonality. And it's not like mind-blowing that there's seasonality with aspergillus, but if this information could be properly documented and shared with the world, then people that are, don't want to fail for aspergillus would know when to be most cautious about it. And we see these two peaks here. They're happening around the same time throughout the year. And another interesting thing here is that Aspergillus terreus should be around the same level as the other species, subspecies of Aspergillus, but it's not. And that's likely because there is under incubation. So labs are trying to get this test done as soon as possible, and they're incubating for only 24 hours instead of the required, at least 48 hours.
Oh.
Another piece. I won't have too many of these, but I just want to kind of paint a picture of there's so many different things that could be studied in this data. And do interrupt me.
I was going to say, I hope you have a bunch of them. I'd love to just break all this shit down because I think it's been fascinating.
So another one. What is potency? Is there potency growth? Is potency the same in every state? Is what is potency is the same at all times? So when someone asks, what is the average potency, the follow-up question that someone needs to ask is, when are you asking? Because potency is increasing over time. Every year, it's a little bit more potent than it was the year before. And so this, I'm teaming up with who I think is absolutely awesome to answer this question. What is potency? What is the average? And what is could be identified as the maximum amount of potency? We won't be able to answer that biologically, but we will be able to answer the question of, out of the 10,000 samples available in your state, how many of them could actually be over 30% or over 40%?
It's a great question. And the 40% thing, you mentioned that earlier too. And I think most people know that flower just doesn't test that high.
Well, statistically it will. As in, like, 1 out of X number of samples will be at 40%, and we can answer that question. So statistically, we'll be able to answer that, so long as we also have the answer, when are you asking? Like in 2024, let's say 1 out of 2,000 will be there. Okay, moving on.
Will you tell us can you go back to that for a second? Will you tell us, it looks like the lab IDs are kind of randomized over here. Is that how you do this analysis, Yasha?
So most of the data that we receive from states, I specifically request for the lab to be de-identified. That removes any potential bias or me looking at like news articles by any lab about any lab. It's just like, this is the data from lab X, lab Y, lab Z.
Thanks for explaining that.
In some cases,
some of the people who watch my show, we need this explanation, and I do too sometimes. So please, thank you for breaking that down.
Yeah. So sometimes states do provide the lab names, and then before I share the full data set with whatever scientists I'm working with, but I also share a separate file where they're de-identified, and that's the files that we typically use. And anyone can get access to this data. Once anyone receives it through a FOIA, anyone else can ask that same department for this data. There's no more work. It just they reshare the same file.
Do you have this stuff posted on your website anywhere?
I don't, but I've shared it with many people. If anyone wants access to this data, I can't share all of it because some states made me sign an NDA, but most of it I can share.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So in November of 2023, so 7 months ago, the Cannabis Control Commission in Massachusetts proposed a water activity test. And they said water activity should be between 0.55 and 0.65. 2 numbers. And the reason why they said that is because anything over 0.65 would likely lead to more mold growth over time. And anything less than 0.55 would have chemical decomposition, would have chemical breakdowns, trichomes would fall off and be dry. And they proposed this with good intent. This is a test that they think is the right one to do, and they set those limits. But I believe that they didn't look at the data that's available, the data that I've been talking about. Because if we were to apply those limits, the 0.55 to 0.65, to all the cannabis testing data from results in Maryland, less than 30% of flowers would have passed, which means they either would have crashed the market by making 70% of the market, 70% of the flowers fail.
And that's just on the basis of this water activity, which according to the slide you showed not too long ago, there's really not a correlation there. And now
there's not a correlation.
Rule,
there's not a correlation during the initial compliance test, but likely flowers that are on the shelves for months, if they originally had high water activity, they will likely have more mold later on. So that's the purpose of it.
Okay.
But here we see that if they looked at Maryland data, they would have seen that setting a lower limit is going to kill the market or increase result manipulation by labs. Same thing over the 120,000 data points from Michigan. Less than 20% of flowers in Michigan would have passed the proposed limits set by Massachusetts. Same thing in Oregon. And this is across the 6 states from which we have data. Hundreds of thousands of data points, and not looking at the data would have caused a market collapse.
Wow.
So we have this great opportunity with this data to set policies, to be data informed, along with the information that they used for the upper and lower limit. They need to also use this information to set good policy.
I was going to say, do you know where they came up with that number? It looked like 0.6 or whatever. You were like, do you know where that came from?
Yep. So there was the right scientists did the right work 10, 12 years ago. And they came up with those numbers identifying, in theory, what would be the ideal. And those were the 0.55 to 0.65. But that's only in theory. We also need to take into account the practicality. What would practically happen if these flowers were tested? Not all of them are going to be ideal.
What's the, do you want to talk about the chain of custody at all? Like I know in Vermont, everybody gets to pick their own samples and bring them to the lab. I don't know how that works in Massachusetts, but maybe you could fill us in on that if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, let me think on it, how to best answer.
Yeah. It seems like every state has a different method for doing everything, and, might make it tricky.
Yeah. So I guess the two different approaches. Three different approaches. One is the cultivator decides which samples to give to the lab for testing. The problem there is that what if the cultivator selects a non-representative sample, a sample that does not represent all the products that are going to be sold, possibly from
cherry picking,
either cherry picking or just something that is from their best pile of very other product. Higher potency, no contaminants is the one that they actually care to grow, while the thing that they actually sell and put the label on is something else. That's a problem, of course. So that's option one. And option two is the laboratory is the one that comes in and picks. But the laboratory is also possibly incentivized to work with the cultivator. What if the cultivator says, I'm not going to work with the laboratory that picks the wrong samples? So there's that problem. And then the third is what New York is doing, which is a sampling company. Someone that has to have a license for sampling, knows the procedure, ideally not associated with the lab, or the cultivator should be third party. Not how it is in New York, but that's an ideal. Would come into the cultivation, select the right product, possibly the sampler is selected relatively randomly, and then that's what the laboratory receives. That's probably the ideal, that last version.
Cool. Thanks for explaining that. Yeah, and I've also heard maybe about the state, we'll send the regulatory agency, pick up your samples, which, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the best way is to do this. It seems like every way has some pros and some cons.
It does, but there are also checks and balances that can be put in place so that this problem is not significant. Whichever approach is taken, if there are off-the-shelf testing programs or secret shopper programs where a regulator takes products off the shelves, sends them to labs, and sees whether the labels accurately depict the product inside. If it does not represent the product inside, then there should be a product recall. This would disincentivize everyone involved from inaccurately labeling. And some states do this. And those states have a lot of recalls and less opportunity for manipulation, or more risk. So fewer people are manipulating results.
Hmm.
Labs, fewer cultivators.
And since you took your screen down for a second, I'm just going to share one of mine real quick here in case anybody that's watching, we got 3 people watching, but anybody that sees this, if you're interested, there's a couple of stories here featuring Yasha. They're both from MJ Biz Daily. This one is from November of last year. Marijuana lab testing analysis finds routine THC inflation. If you guys are interested in reading about any of these things, and data manipulation. That's written by Chris Roberts. Sorry for this obnoxious ad that popped up. But I'd like to also ask. It seems like, do you have any numbers on like the THC results?
Absolutely, I do.
Yeah, you want to pull some of this up because, and here's Jason Cooley, PhD. We would fail greater than 70% at least at 0.55 minimum number.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for watching, Jason. Yeah, this is all news to me. I don't.
But if regulators don't speak to labs and set policy blindly, that's what's going to happen. Okay, so some potency numbers. Share my screen again.
Yeah, I'll pull it right up.
Okay, so I have so many slides, and I'd love to share all of them. So I'll start with this, and if you have more deeper questions, I can find other excellent, or what I think is excellent explanations.
Yeah, I'd like to also talk about pesticides and heavy metals and shit like that, but the THC inflation seems like the biggest issue that's going on in the lab testing space right now, and I know that you've been involved in some stories here, so I thought we'd start there.
Yep. Okay, actually, why don't we start here? So a cultivator is testing with a laboratory, and they decide to switch laboratories. That's the moment that their potency increases by 28%. So by having the cannabis testing data from so much cannabis testing data from different states, we can find really obvious stories that are happening. So here, this one cultivator and all of their THC tests throughout 2022. On the left, they're testing with the lab in blue. On the right, they're testing with lab in orange. The moment that they switch labs is the moment that their potency increases by 28%. And of course, you can say something happened overnight. That is the exact same day that we started to blank, whatever it is. But we can also take a look at every single cultivator represented by every line on this slide that switched to this one lab, lab 2. On the left is their potency at the previous lab, whatever lab it was. On the right is their potency at this lab. And regardless of who the cultivator is, the moment that they switch labs is the moment that they increase in potency.
Is this data just from one state, or is this from all the states?
No, this is a single laboratory in Massachusetts who, regardless of who the cultivator is, they got a huge bump in potency overnight. Make sense?
Does that seem unusual? Have you looked at all the other labs, or is this like a unique case, or how? I mean,
yeah. Okay. So let me skip to some other. Okay, so a quick thing on why a lab does it. It's because labs that inflate potency increase in market share. Those labs that give higher potency, they continually get more of the cultivator clients because cultivators are able to sell their products for more. Okay, and now to try to answer the question that you just asked, is this normal? Hold on.
I said, is it unusual?
Unusual. Okay, I want to not answer your question at first. I want to answer a different question that you didn't ask.
Cool. Yeah, I was hoping you'd pull that shit up.
Yeah, and then I'll get back to your question about what's usual, what's unusual. So first, the word normal distribution. In most naturally occurring things, we have a normal distribution. For example, for men's heights, there's some men that are 5'2" and some that are 7 foot tall, but most are right in the middle, and we get this bell curve looking thing. Same thing applies to newborn weight weight of newborns, shoe sizes, ACT scores, whatever else. And in cannabis, we see the same thing. So most labs who have THC results have normal distributions for those THC results. And it looks like bell curves. I can keep going, but there's, almost all labs that have enough data have a shape that looks like this. And so a question is, what's not normal? What happens when, why would a laboratory have results that do not look like that bell curve? And so again, this is men's heights. The average male, full-grown male in the US is 5'9". But if we were to ask men, as someone did from the CDC, if they were to ask, when they asked 200,000 men how tall they are, the answer was, a little bit different. So everyone is a little bit taller, according to, if you ask them directly. And there's a curious little dip right at 5'11", because, hey, no, I'm 6 feet. And
I'm 5'11", 6. I'm one of those guys. Yeah.
So a reason for this is, and this is from years ago, but I'm pretty sure it's exactly the same still. 49% of women use height as a filter on dating websites. And so it's understandable that, why not just stay on 6 foot tall? And so in cannabis, we also know what the incentives are. Products under 20% don't sell flowers. And if you can get over 25%, great, 30%, incredible. And the higher it goes, the better. And so we get sometimes distributions that look like this. It's as though this lab has an internal mantra. Do not report anything under 20%. If you can get it to 25, please do. In another state, also, there's nothing reported right under 20%. But right after 20%, there's a bunch. And of course, another dip right before the 25 mark and before the 30 mark. This cannot happen, or it's very unlikely that this would happen through random selection. There's most likely some sort of human intervention to hit these price points. And here's another one. This, many states have at least one lab that has this approach to getting the results to the clients that they want. And there are some tools that are used in forensics, typically in finance, data forensics, to identify what is feasible and what is not when applied to a normal distribution or naturally occurring products. Okay, so that was to answer the question that I wanted to answer, not the one that you asked. What you asked, I think, was, how common is this? How common is the potency inflation? Right?
Well, or is it unusual? I think is what I said. But yeah, I think you understand what I'm getting at here. Yeah. And this is what you showed me, which really caught my attention. I wasn't the best scientist, but I went to engineering school, and I've seen some graphs like that, and discontinuities are always an issue. So yeah, the way it tied into this was really had my attention.
So now that I've presented that, I want to answer the previous question about how common is this. John Oliver, he has a show on HBO. That dude, he 5, 10, 15 years ago had this segment where he wanted to get a debate between scientists that believe that there is climate change and scientists who believe that there isn't. But instead of just getting one on one side, one on the other, he said 98% of scientists agree that there is climate change. Only 2% are on the other side. So he invited 98 scientists on one side. It was a huge crowd, and 2 on the other side. And it kind of showed that it's not really showing what the consensus is if you get a one-on-one debate. So keeping that in mind, I want to answer the question of how common is potency result manipulation. So first off, labs that have manipulated potency have been closed across the country. Many labs have been closed for doing so. But the way that they manipulate results differs. Not all of them do so the same way. Not all laboratories that manipulate results do so in the same way. So they would actually have to argue with each other on how they got their results. So I'll explain. Around 2% of labs manipulate results by dry labbing. Labs have been closed for this. All they do is, not all they do, but they type in the numbers for what potency or what contaminant screen results the client wants. You want 30%, I'll type in 30%.
Right. So dry labbing is like, hey, let's just not do it and say we did kind of thing. Like you don't even test it at all. Could you explain that for people who don't understand?
So I guess there's two different definitions of dry labbing. One of them is don't do the test at all and just write in what's needed. That takes much less time and it has no cost to it. Another definition is you do the test, but you do it in a way that manipulates the process to get the result that you want. And so, I don't know, take it either way, but multiple labs have been identified as those that are dry labbing.
Do you want to explain some of the ways? And I know I've talked about this with, a lot of the other guys, Josh, for sure. Do you want to explain some of the ways that people manipulate tests real quick if they, for people who might be listening that haven't seen any of those shows?
Sure. So let's say you take an individual sample and you want to manipulate the results. One of them is just write in the answer that the client wants. Let's say for a safety screen, like mold, something is 12,000 when the limit is 10,000. Well, why don't you just test it again and again and again until you get the result that you want? And that's testing into compliance. It's no longer representative. One out of the 7 tests that got the result you want is the one that you share. So that's a way to manipulate. Another one is to, knowing that a product is going to fail, manipulate one of the steps during the process. Don't homogenize the product before testing it for total yeast and mold, for example. Manipulate one of those processes. Another approach is approaches for potency inflation. I would categorize those as 2 different approaches. One is where pretty much everyone in the lab is aware. That means, someone, when they teach how to subsample, how to get, how to weigh products, they say get as many trichomes in there as possible. So they're purposely trying to get pretty much keef into the weigh boat and test that. That does not represent the product that they received, but it will test higher than the actual product that they received. That's, an SOP-based approach where everyone in the lab is doing the same thing. A lone wolf approach, this is another one, there's the everyone in the lab knows, and then there's the kind that only maybe 1 or 2 people in the lab know. A lone wolf approach is to manipulate the instrument, calibrate it in a way so that you would always get, let's say, 20% higher potency. A way to do so is, so every 3 to 6 months, let's say an instrument, a curve needs to be set. And so you use standards, you pipette, and you set the curve so that everything after tested on that instrument after that is compared to that original curve. And if you manipulate it, you can set it so that everything tested on that instrument afterwards is 20% more potent. And by doing so, no one in the lab knows other than that one person that said it. And everyone that tests there gets 20% higher potency. I can keep going, but it's approaches like that.
Can I ask you a question? We got a question up here from Rumus. Are you open to the idea of posting the de-identified data in a public GitHub repository?
I absolutely am. And you should get in touch with Keegan Skeet, who hosts an excellent cannabis data science meetup, because he already has a lot of this data on his GitHub.
Word up.
If you search for cannabis data science meetup, you'll find it. I highly advise anyone interested in this to join that group. It's, I think, 6:30 Eastern Standard Time on Thursdays.
Keegan Skeet, data scientist, Analytics, Olympia, Washington. Okay, cool. I'm gonna hit him up. Cool. All right, let's carry on with this. Sorry to sidetrack you a little bit there.
Thanks. Okay, so 2% of labs are dry labbing, and they're getting high potency. Moisture. Labs can manipulate moisture because in states where moisture adjustment is mandatory, more moisture means you're going to be able to adjust the potency to be higher. And so in these states, the average moisture is 9.7%. And this is just a demonstration. Look, these are the numbers.
And that was Oregon and Maryland. Yeah. Okay.
This is Oregon, Maryland, but we have labs in nearly every state that have a much higher moisture result on average. For example, in Maryland, there's one lab that has 12.5% instead of the 9.5% that's expected. So 35% higher moisture. And this interesting lab in Oregon, Oregon has a limit for moisture. It can't go over 15%. And this lab seems to be very precise in testing its flowers for moisture, not to go over that limit, but increasing it as much as possible, because by increasing the moisture, they can get the cannabinoids to be higher. So this is just another way, and maybe 6%, 7% of labs manipulate or accidentally find more moisture than all the other labs.
Does that work with cannabinoids too, or terpenes, or does it just work with THC in terms of like comparison to the moisture content?
Cannabinoids. So typically in these states, cannabinoids are moisture adjusted. In some states, they are moisture adjusted.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I already showed you this. Most labs have a normal distribution for their THC, but some labs have these discontinuities. Maybe 6% of labs, 7% of labs. But again, these labs would have to argue with the moisture adjusting labs because they're getting similar average potencies, but in different ways. They're doing different approaches. Next is this curious approach. I know that there's a lab in Michigan, in Oregon, and this one's from Massachusetts. So each line here represents an individual cultivator that tests at this lab. On the left is their potency at whatever other lab they were using before. On the right is their potency with this lab. The red lines represent cultivators that got a 20% or higher increase in potency. So big potency inflation. And those also happen to be their biggest clients. And it's a business development tactic to not risk giving inflating potency for everything, but only for the clients it's worth doing that for. The cultivators doing that for. And then the lines in red, those cultivators also have a failure rate with this lab that's half as high as it was at their previous labs. So it's a white glove service that they provide for their best clients.
So potency is going up, and the failure rates for other things are also going down at the same time. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, for these specific folks. Does that make sense?
Some of those are pretty big jumps there, like 12.5 to 22. I mean, that's more than 20% there, dude.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
That's
all the red ones, the orange ones also get a pretty nice bump. The gray ones, you're not VIPs, you're not getting a bump. And then lastly, it's the folks, the labs that provide higher potency to everyone that goes to their labs. It's not sample specific, so it's not like they're elevating just the ones that are under 20% to over 20%, or just their largest cultivator clients, but they do it for every one of their cultivator clients.
Well, you don't want to discriminate.
Yeah. they're the upstanding ones that we all want to be like.
Customer service.
I know, right? Okay, I hope that answers that question.
Sure thing, dude. Yeah, thanks for sharing all that, man. That gives me a really good picture. Do you know the total amount of labs that you've looked at across the country? I know you showed all the states, but do you know a total number of all the labs?
How many labs are in the country?
No, well, okay, that's a good question too, but also how many you've looked at to analyze this data set?
So 3 of the states did not provide information about labs, so it's just data on samples, so no labs from those. And from the other states, it's 127 labs. So 127 labs across 8 states.
It feels like a pretty good cross. Do you know how many there are in the country total for cannabis?
My guess is around 350.
Yeah, so that's a pretty good slice of numbers that you got there.
Yeah, I might be wrong, but I don't know, somewhere.
Do you have the I feel like we talked about the yeast and mold stuff too. I don't know if you slapped those up yet, but I'd love to talk about that a little bit. And also, just the pesticide testing too. I have like some questions about, but maybe we could do the yeast and mold thing.
Yeah, let's do it. Now let me find the right screens first. Okay, so I'll demonstrate what's happening in Massachusetts, if you don't mind.
I don't mind. That's why I brought you on the show, Yasha. Here, let me slap your logo up here. While you're doing that, I'm supposed to do this.
I'm ready.
Once in a while. I'm supposed to say, hey, I'm here with Yasha Kahn, co-founder of MCR Labs. Got a little lost in that discussion and forgot, but here we go. Wham, bam.
Okay. So we have data from some states, and I've spoken to a lot of regulators, and the typical failure rate or amount of samples tested for total yeast and mold which have more mold than 10,000 colony forming units per gram. Around 15%, that was a really complicated way to say it. Around 15% of flowers have failed this test when the limit is set at 10,000 CFU per gram. That's in the states where we got any data, or states where data is publicly available. But in Massachusetts, the failure rate is much lower, at just under 7%. And the big question is why? How could it be that Massachusetts has so many fewer flowers that are failing? Because it's a very, I don't want to say moldy state, but it's a very humid state. One of the more humid states. So I would assume that there would be more failure for mold here. But is it the borders that are protecting us? What is happening in Massachusetts? And what we can do with these awesome data sets is look a little deeper and see that it's specific laboratories that are not detecting mold. Most labs in Massachusetts detect a good amount of mold and fail around 15%, or a higher percentage of flowers. But there are a few labs that have a failure rate that's between 2 and 4%, sometimes less than 2%. And this was in 2021, same thing in 2022 and 2023. And these labs consistently have these excellent failure rates, or failure rates that are not seen in any other state by any other lab. And the reason why a cultivator might want to go to such a lab is because failing is expensive. Remediation is expensive. I mean, there's some ways that are the most popular way, I assume now, is irradiation, but that's expensive. Not everyone wants to do that.
I got Rad Source coming on the show on Thursday. That's going to be a great talk.
Yeah. Investing into a cleaner facility takes a long time. You have to set up new SOPs, training, clean out the entire facility, possibly invest into a new HVAC system, do a lot of testing, do all this stuff, lose months of opportunity for grow, or find a lab that doesn't detect mold. And that's the alternative. And this
nice slide there, Yasha.
That was a MasterCard commercial, priceless. Okay, so this cultivator, these are all of their total yeast and mold tests throughout 2022. On the left, they're testing with one lab, and at some point they switch labs. That's the moment at which their failure rate drops from 14% down to 0. They never fail again. How wonderful is that? And what we can do with this wonderful data set is look at every cultivator that switches to this lab. On the left is their failure rate. Each line here represents an individual cultivator. On the left is their failure rate at their previous lab. On the right is their failure rate at this one laboratory. And in every single case, the failure rate goes down, and sometimes from 30 or 40% down to 0. This happens overnight.
That's like 6, 7, 8, something zeros there, huh? Yeah, some of these coming up from almost 40.
Yeah. And the products that are tested here, the cultivators that test at these labs, they don't need to worry about mold.
And there's like 2 that went up too. I wonder what they were doing.
I don't think any of them went up. It just looks that way because the other ones have such a
sharp. Okay. It looked like a couple of yeah.
No, all of them go down. Take into account that this is only cultivators that have tested at least 10 samples at each of the two labs that are represented here. So, it's slightly filtered, but this is the case. This is what's happening. This is a lab that you can go to if you want these kind of results. Why would a lab do this? Money. So laboratories that have a failure rate that is 3 to 4 times lower than what's seen in any other state, than what's seen in Massachusetts, they increase in market share. So in the 6 months from which we have data in 2021, these labs increased in market share by 10%, or around $3 million annualized. And for relatively small companies like labs, this is a lot of money.
Yeah, it's 3 million ain't chump change. That's
and this continues. Right, this continues year after year, where laboratories that provide these kind of results, it's a business strategy. Provide these kind of results. Consumers get moldy products. Employees continue to work in moldy rooms with moldy products. It's a problem.
Do you think? Do you think any of the regulations going on are making it more cost prohibitive for lab competition in the cannabis industry?
Let me think about what that means.
Of course, here's a hypothetical I'd like to pose to everyone. If you were in charge of Massachusetts and you ran the state, what kind of rules would you put in place that you think could make this better? Or what kind of rules would you get rid of? Or do you think there's any good rules that are in place that are helpful?
So back to the soapbox that I started on at first, we have so much data from all states that have done any kind of testing. And we know that some tests are just not needed. I don't think any lab has ever found any vitamin E acetate in any licensed products. Don't quote me. We just have so much.
Is that a required test? Yeah.
Required tests for vapes. Don't quote me on that, but I'm just saying we have so much data that if we see that there is no additive of a certain kind, let's not force the market to pay for tests that are not relevant. So that's we just need to look at the data and identify how can we improve. In Massachusetts, we have a secret shopper program that I believe is just not being used. If it was being used, that would be great. I would make all cannabis testing data publicly available. That's something that is nearly free. I mean, you have to host it on your website or Google Drive or wherever else, but it allows whoever wants to take a look at the industry. Is the industry honest? And are regulators doing their jobs?
Can I slap a question in here for you, Yasha?
Of course.
This is from Tom, the ganja delivery guy here. Can we talk about price differences in other states? For example, Vermont is $2,200 for 5 samples. What are other states charging for the same panel? Do you know an answer to that, Yasha?
Yeah, I think it's very state specific. Some tests are much more expensive than others. If you need to test for 100 pesticides across multiple instruments, then the amount of work, the instrumentation, the standards needed are just really much more expensive. So let's say I know that in Arizona right now, the prices for lab testing is so low that I would suspect at least some are probably dry labbing. You cannot make a profit at those prices at like $200 for a full panel. I know some states have significantly higher panel costs. I think $2,200 for 5 samples, that's probably a little bit above average. But when you get more labs to compete, that would bring down the prices. But also regulators need to adjust the regulations and make sure that testing is not being done just for the sake of testing, but for the sake of safety and accuracy. That would also bring down prices.
And I want to slap this one up too here. If your state already has a public data portal, it's trivial to add the cannabis testing data to it. So CRADA can pull from Metric or BioTrack APIs.
Yeah,
I'm not
I mean,
really sure what that means.
listen, I completely agree that they should. State regulators that have shared their data without a fight, some of them have been absolutely excellent. And in some, there has been fraud found, and some there hasn't been. States that have something to hide, I have had to fight tooth and nail to get their data. I've lost a couple of them. But if you're a regulator, you've been paid for your job for the last 5 years, and then someone like me is gonna, or like you, is gonna get a hold of the data and say, "Hey, no one's been watching over this, and billions of dollars of product has been sold that has been purposefully mislabeled." Then you, as the regulator, may not want that information to get out. So, while I think theoretically all of us believe open data is good, there's some folks that don't benefit from it, and they will stand in the way of making data public.
Wow. And that's hard. Yeah. It doesn't seem like freedom of information. If it was freedom of information, it would be easier to get. And I got one. Hey, I've got to slap this up here too. This is Carly Bader from Willow Industries, man. Wow. Thanks for this incredible data. We know it happens, but to see it through these graphs and these jumps at certain levels of marketing / labeling is really chiseling it into stone. And Carly, hey, thanks for watching the show. It was a pleasure having you on as well.
Yeah, Carly, I have many more slides to show. I didn't want to bore you guys with just PowerPoint.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I have much more, from mold to actually mold and potency are the biggest I have data on, but those are also the ones that I requested.
Yeah.
And those are the ones that have the biggest financial influence on whether a product is going to get sold and how much it's going to get sold for. So it has the biggest likelihood of being manipulated.
Okay. Well,
but
hey,
if Carly,
it's Yasha Kahn, MCR Labs. Sorry, I'm just slapping that up there again. This is fantastic, Yasha.
Yeah. Carly or anyone else that wants to take a much deeper dive on what's happening in whatever state or across the country, I think getting this information out to those, especially within our industry, those that set policies, those that influence policies, is going to influence and make this industry better in the future. So anyone that wants access to the data, to the analysis, please get in touch.
What else you got left for us, Yasha?
Oh, Caleb, we only have 2 minutes left. I have much more.
I look, I try to keep it to an hour, but I don't put a cap on shit. If you got more, dude, let's do it.
How about this? I'll do one more thing that I think is fascinating, and then
we can also do a part 2, maybe, if you're down. And I want to thank you so much for your time today, man. This has been a fascinating discussion for sure. And if you're down to do another one, I'm sure we could do another 17 hours.
Oh, I can talk about this all day, and some days I do. Okay, I'm going to share my screen just to show a different perspective on mold. Do you see my screen? Oh, you're about to.
I'm going to pull it up. Yep. Bang.
Okay, so I showed this screen before already. It shows, Massachusetts, we have 16 labs or so. I'm just showing that, look, there are labs with higher failure rates. There are labs with lower failure rates. This is compared to other states. California, this relatively irrelevant nuance, doesn't have the total yeast and mold test, but this is taken from a study that I think was really well done from California samples. This is what data looks like. So we took all of the total yeast and mold results from Maryland, and we put it on a histogram that's on a logarithmic scale. And what we have is most flowers have no mold, and that's what we would see on the far left. Some flowers have some mold, and very few flowers have an incredible amount of mold. This is when you already see mold on the product. This is just the shape, just to demonstrate this is what the shape of data is. In 2022, we have about the same shape. 2023, we have about the same shape. This is all Maryland, and other states look very similar to this. But this is Massachusetts in 2023, where we have this steep cliff right at the action limit. And so it's as though the mold knows that if it was to multiply past this action limit of 10,000 colony forming units per gram, this flower would fail. And we can
The
take
mold
a look at
knows.
what's that?
Sentient mold. Yes.
Yeah. It's Massachusetts, very educated mold. And we can take a look at those two labs that have a failure rate that's under 4%. And we see that it's those specific labs that are responsible for this sentience of mold, that products that go to specifically those two labs are ones that have this steep cliff right at the action limit. And if we were to remove those labs from the data set, then the data set looks pretty much like it should. And then that's ready the next presentation. But ta-da.
Oh,
that was it.
Bang.
Yeah. So just a different perspective of mold, where it's not just the number of, not just the failure rate, not just. So it's the failure rate is a interesting issue, but feasible. Cultivators switching from one lab to another and all of them getting a lower failure rate, strange. Those same cultivators then switching back to other labs and their failure rate goes back up, also strange. And mold knowing where the action limit is, just another perspective on the same issue. How is it feasible? I would love anyone to answer that question, that all of these things are happening. It's not product selection. Yeah.
I'm going to slap one last comment up here from my man, Tom. This is a major topic that needs more discussion for sure. Props to Caleb and Yasha for bringing this topic to the table. And Tom, if you didn't see earlier, I posted some of the stories that Yasha was involved in here. I'll share that one more time before we get out of here. Oh, shit. Oh, that stupid thing is still up there from MJ Biz. It's marijuana testing. Marijuana lab testing analysis finds routine THC inflation, data manipulation. And Tom, there's another couple stories up there, and you got my number, dude. If you want to call me, I can definitely put you in touch here. Yasha Kahn, one more time. I'm going to slap your logo up there. Co-founder of MCR Labs. I want to thank you for being here. This is the end of the show. If you have any shameless plugs or shout outs or anything that you think we missed, I'd like to give you the last minute here, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you, man. Thanks for doing
this. Caleb, thank you. Everyone else that's fighting this fight loudly, big thank you. I think this aspect of the industry, testing, needs to improve for the patients, for the consumers, employees, all honest entities. Every entity in the industry knows that this is happening, and the moment, as soon as we can make it go away, is the moment that products start to improve. Caleb, thank you.
Well, plug for your brother too, for sharing. Thank you, guys. Oh, and one more question. I forgot. I got one more that I just remembered. I was going to ask you, and I forgot to ask Josh this too, but like, how do you think that we could maybe create a unified standards for testing around the country? Because it seems like that's going to be a big challenge. Do you have any thoughts on that, Yasha, before we leave?
So I'm going to speak. I will be speaking on a panel next week at ASTM about this exact thing with pesticides. I think CANRA, USP, ASTM, maybe some other organizations are already in place to set standards. We have the data. We have years, decades of experience with cannabis testing. It's no longer the 37 separate experiments, or it is, but we actually have the results of each one of those states' experiments, with which we can see what works and what doesn't. I don't have answers on anything specific because public health officials are supposed to set these, and labs are supposed to just come in and say, yes, we will test as requested. But we have the information. We have the organizations that need to make the recommendations, make the suggestions to regulators and policymakers.
Cool. Thanks for taking that one too, man. I forgot about that, and then I just saw it in my notes before we get out of here. Hey, it's Yasha Kahn. Thanks again, Yasha. This has been fantastic. I'll repost it all tomorrow. Please stick around for a minute if you would. Guys, check out MCR Labs. I'm your host, Caleb Teskey. And remember, the devil's in the details, and the details are in the fine print. Peace.